Right now, a draft report sits in an internal folder at a major central bank. Its title sounds technical and harmless. Monetary Overdrive Scenarios. Case Studies Spain, Britain, Weimar, United States. The first line is less harmless. Empires rarely fall first from enemy assault. They usually fall from believing they can print their way out of arithmetic. There is no drama in the tone, only a dry sequence. Army, then money, then printing, then debt, then collapse. At the end of the contents page, there is one short line. External threats speed up decline. Internal printing offices cause it. The report starts with a simple observation. In every case, the printing press does not appear at the beginning of the story. It enters the game when the empire is already strong. The army is already financed. Trade routes are already under control. The currency is already trusted beyond its own borders. At that point, new money is not a tool to build power. It is a tool to delay the cost of maintaining power. That is why, inside the system, printing always looks like a temporary measure. Spain is the first modern case study. In the 16th century, the crown doesn't yet have a mechanical press in the modern sense, but the function is the same. Mass issuance of money under political pressure. Silver from Potosi and other mines floods into Europe. At first, it feels like a cheat code. You send ships, you bring back metal, you mint coins, you pay armies. For a while, the world accepts the Spanish real as a hard unit backed by real metal, and almost no one asks how many of those coins are already in circulation. The printing equivalent here is the decision to convert every new shipment of silver into more wage money without adjusting taxes or spending. From Madrid's point of view, the mechanism looks rational. Wars are expensive but politically necessary. Raising taxes risks revolt. Cutting campaigns risks losing prestige and losing access to more silver. So the crown leans on the mint. More coins mean more short-term liquidity. Prices start to drift upward, but slowly, with a lag of years. Chronic inflation in Spain during the so-called price revolution is not described at the time as printing money. It is described as abundance of metal and external shocks. The substance does not change. When the money supply grows faster than real productivity, purchasing power falls. Over several decades, a pattern appears. Nominal flows through the royal treasury look impressive. On paper, the empire looks richer, but the real base, industry, crafts, agriculture, becomes less competitive. Cheap silver makes imports attractive and domestic production complacent. Creditors still finance Spain because its coin moves across Europe. This is the first important link in the report. Once a currency becomes international, excess issuance is not punished right away. That is what makes the printing press more dangerous than an external enemy. From Spain, the report moves to Britain because Britain shows the same logic in paper form rather than silver form. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the British state is deeply dependent on an expanding money supply. The Bank of England, formally independent, is in practice integrated into the war machine. For each new campaign and each new naval mobilization, new debt instruments are issued. Those pieces of paper turn into quasi-printed money because banks use them as collateral and as a base for extra lending. The key moment here is the gap between language and math. Officially, this is not called deficit financing by the printing press. It is called liquidity management and supporting stability. In practice, It is the same thing that Spain did. Military and political goals outrun the tax base, and the gap is closed with issuance. The only difference is that instead of a coin with less silver content, you get a note with a higher face value. Another important element is the prestige of the pound. Britain controls sea lanes. London is the main clearing point for global trade, and the pound is used well beyond the island itself. This creates what the report calls a tolerance zone for excess issuance. As long as the rest of the world needs pounds for trade and reserves, it will tolerate a higher level of debt and inflation than it would ever tolerate from a smaller country. At this point, the printing press turns from a tool into a temptation. If the market does not punish us right away, we can try one more round. Weimar Germany enters as a separate, but very telling case. Here there is no classic overseas empire, but the storyline is familiar. A state convinces itself that it can print its way out of debt and reparations. The initial motive looks rational. There is almost no gold. Access to normal capital markets is limited. The economy is damaged. Political pressure is rising. The printing press is seen as a temporary bridge, an emergency mode. Very quickly, that bridge becomes the only road. In Weimar, the break in the social contract is visible. At first, people accept new banknotes because they still trust the state and see no alternative. Then they start turning every spare unit of currency into hard assets: land, gold, foreign notes. Then they stop trusting any nominal promise. This does not happen overnight. It is a process. In the report's internal language, this is the loss of anchor phase, the point where money stops being a stable unit of value and becomes only paper with a number printed on it. Modern examples are added not to create drama, but to show repetition. Countries with chronic deficits, from parts of Latin America to parts of the European periphery, pass through the same stages of faith in their own printing options. At first, the issue of money or quasi-money is sold as an anti-crisis program and temporary support for demand. Then it becomes a habit. Year after year, budgets are written on the assumption that the central bank will cover the gap. The important nuance is this: it is not always raw Weimar-style printing. More often, it is a mix of low interest rates, bond purchases, and off-balance sheet operations. To an outside viewer, this looks like technical work by monetary policy committees. To the system, it is the same substance: extra money supply not backed by extra productivity. And every time this regime lasts longer than first promised, it starts to look less like an exception and more like the new baseline. At that point, the link back to empire becomes obvious. Spain got used to silver, Britain got used to paper, Weimar got used to the press, and modern economies get used to permanently easy money. Each phase starts as a temporary emergency mode. Each phase ends with a structural shift, a deep devaluation, a default, or a political reset. The second half of the report moves from historical maps to the structure of the anomaly and asks a sharper question: what exactly are we seeing when a country starts to truly believe it can print a way out of any problem? The first sign is language. Where people once used the word debt, they start to talk about a policy tool. Where deficit used to mean a problem, officials now use phrases like managed balance sheet expansion. This is not an outright lie. It is a shift of focus, away from risk and toward instrument. The second sign is a change in time horizon. In normal financial logic, the key question is simple: Will this economy be able to service this debt 10 or 20 years from now? In printing logic, the question changes. It becomes, how can we make sure the market accepts the next wave of bonds today? Long-term sustainability is replaced with short-term manageability. In Imperial settings, that swap always came wrapped in nice phrases about, "We will handle structural issues later, after we stabilize the situation." The third sign is the behavior of those who see internal data ahead of the public. In Spain, that was the court circle that first turned silver coins into land and titles. In Britain, that was the financial houses that exited the most fragile claims before major devaluations. In Weimar, that was the insiders who bought hard assets early in the inflation spiral. Today, it can be large funds, senior officials, and connected entities that start to tilt their portfolios away from assets tied to one currency's fate. The fourth sign is the response of regulators. At first, they publish warnings. Then they publish strategic roadmaps. Then they quietly push deadlines out and soften targets. It does not look like a conspiracy. It looks like constant deferral. At the same time, the technical memos that circulate in a narrow circle become more blunt. Public reports stay calm. Internal notes start to discuss scenarios of restructuring and controlled devaluation. Against that backdrop, the authors come back to the core claim. External enemies rarely destroy an empire alone. They just trigger the final break in a structure already weakened by its own printing behavior. On the surface, it looks like defeat in a war or a shock driven by some outside force. Inside, it is the end of a long phase where the state chose between political pain now and financial pain later, and systematically chose later. One specific section deals with a very familiar line from public debate. This time is different. Our case is special. Spaniards said that about their silver. They insisted that real metal made them safe. The British said that about the pound. They believed an old and respected currency would always be a safe harbor. Early Weimar officials explained that the inflation was a temporary side effect of reparations and would fade once the political questions were settled. In every case, the uniqueness story was strong until the math overruled it. The internal analysis focuses on patterns instead. When a country can issue money that the rest of the world must hold, it gets a real privilege. At the same time, it loses a key feedback signal. The market takes longer to punish mistakes. Politicians take longer to feel the edge. Voters take longer to see the bill. The report calls this Imperial Anesthesia. The pain is pushed into the future. The cause stays in place. Near the end, the military factor returns in a slightly different light. The army that once created power becomes the least flexible spending item. At the point when trust in the currency starts to slip, these costs are the hardest to change. Social programs can be cut. Investment plans can be delayed. For an empire, cutting defense is treated as a strategic defeat. So once more, the printing option looks attractive. One more round of issuance and the choice can be postponed. It is at this intersection of debt, printing, and the military that historical empires moved into their end phase. Not always as a single dramatic crash, more often as a long erosion, devaluation, loss of share in trade, gradual slide from center to background. For a viewer, the important point is that inside each system, there was genuine confidence that we will tweak the monetary levers now and deal with structure later. The last pages return to a dry briefing format. There are no bold predictions, only scenarios. In the first scenario, a country that leans on the printing press still decides to accept political pain. It caps deficits. It reforms spending. It slowly reduces its dependence on money creation. That path means slower growth, disputed elections, and real social conflict. But the system stays under control. In the second scenario, the political class cannot or will not choose that path. Printing remains the default response to every shock. Recession means printing. War means printing. Social pressure means printing. In that world, at some point, the market stops treating that country's obligations as risk-free. Losing anchor status does not have to be a one-day event. But once it is gone, it is far harder to regain than it was to earn. In a third scenario, which the authors rank as less likely but still worth noting, several large currency blocks slowly dilute the central role of any single print shop. That world has no single imperial press. It has more local crises and less global concentration. In such a world, each regional power has less room to print without consequence. Mistakes are punished faster, but they spread less widely. The final line does not offer a verdict, it sets a frame. If overprinting is mostly a technical error in an overgrown system, then the economy in question will go through a hard but manageable correction. If it is a deep belief that any problem can be drowned in new money, then the question is not whether there will be an end, but who will absorb most of the cost. And the last question the report leaves to the viewer is simple and pointed. At this moment, where do you think your own main currency sits between those scenarios? And do you believe that the people running that system fear their own printing press as much as they fear any external rival? There is one more layer in the document that rarely makes it into public debate. It compares the speed of external shocks with the slower, almost invisible speed of monetary degradation. Wars, sanctions, and crises look like sharp edges on a chart. Printing looks like a smooth curve. To most observers, the sharp edges feel dangerous. The smooth curve feels manageable. The report notes that historically, it was almost always the smooth curve that did most of the damage. By the time a visible crisis arrived, the silent part of the balance sheet had already done its work. Another section focuses on trust as a finite resource. In textbooks, money is presented as a neutral tool. In practice, it is a layered promise. A promise by the state, a promise by the banking system, and a promise by the wider economy. Printing tests that promise. At first, trust absorbs the shock. People accept that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. Later, they start to separate official language from their own behavior. They hold more foreign assets. They move savings out of the banking system. They shorten the time horizon of their plans. The report points out that once this behavioral shift reaches a certain threshold, even very skilled monetary management cannot easily reverse it. The authors also raise a point that cuts across ideologies. Different political camps argue over who should control the printing press and for what goals. Some argue for more social spending. Others argue for more defense spending or tax relief. The report does not take sides on those choices. It simply tracks the aggregate. Regardless of motive, the effect on the balance sheet and on the currency is the same. From the point of view of arithmetic, it does not matter whether money is created to fund war, welfare, or corporate bailouts. What matters is the gap between promises and the real capacity of the economy. One more subtle pattern appears in the way public narratives shift over time. Early in the cycle, leaders speak openly about constraints. Balanced budgets and hard trade-offs are praised. Later, the language drifts toward forward guidance, flexibility, and tools. Constraints move off stage. The report highlights that each empire at some point stopped telling its citizens a simple sentence: "We cannot afford this." That silence did not cause the crisis alone, but it removed one of the last cultural breaks on the printing habit. Near the end, the report briefly touches on technology and digital money. Some planners argue that new forms of currency and payment rails will let states manage inflation and debt more precisely. Programmable money, in theory, can be targeted, throttled, or rolled back. The authors acknowledge these tools, but add a caution. If the underlying political incentives do not change, finer control may simply allow the same overprinting behavior to continue longer, and with fewer early warning signs. In that sense, technology could extend the life of the cycle, but also deepen the eventual adjustment. The closing note returns to the viewer's position without breaking the neutral tone. It reminds the reader that most individuals cannot change national policy or shut down a printing press. They can, however, choose how seriously they treat the signals that balance sheets and history are sending. The document does not tell them to buy or sell anything, or to trust or distrust any specific government. It leaves them with a quieter question. When you look at past empires that believed in their own ability to print through every problem, at what point would you have wanted to recognize the pattern? And how different is the present from that point in your own judgment?